In Venezuela, President Nicolas Maduro announced the creation of a special economic fund for the financing of agriculture. In Chile, supermarket employees continue on strike to demand higher wages and better working conditions. The Palestinian Israeli occupation troops launched a strike on Al-Mawasi humanitarian camp, leaving 71 people killed and 89 others wounded. Hello, welcome to From the South. I'm Luis Alberto Matos from the Telesur studios in Havana, Cuba. We begin with the news. President of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, announced the creation of a special economic fund for the financing of Conuquete agriculture. During the national meeting with farmers and small producers held in Acarigua, Portuguese state, the Venezuelan head of state pointed out that the Ministry of Communes and Social Movements will be in charge of guaranteeing that the financing reaches all the land workers. President Maduro also made a recognition to the workers of the land for their efforts to defeat the economic war, the shortage and the attack of imperialism and the surnames. In this sense, he committed himself to guarantee that the national production goes directly to the markets without intermediaries or mediators. Venezuelan opposition leader Carlos Prosperi declared himself independent and announced his support for the presidential candidacy of Nicolas Maduro for the elections of July 28th. During his speech, Prosperi pointed out that President Nicolas Maduro is the only one who can guarantee the peace of the country in view of the destabilization attempts of the far right and the U.S. government. He also denounced a campaign of hate and death threats against opponents who support the candidacy of Nicolas Maduro. Prosperi requested to initiate an investigation against those who participate in acts of parliamentary corruption, the theft of Citgo, and other assets of the nation.
And once the primary elections were over and the development of a sustained campaign based on lies and deceitful offers, telling the Venezuelan people that we were going to reach the end, once the registration was denied because of a political disqualification, they continued insisting that we had to continue moving forward. Yes or yes, we had to move forward. The outrages began against many of us political leaders who were leading a different voice to what we were observing that was not being done well. We even saw with concern how all those irregularities were observed where people who put their names to preserve and protect the cards of their political organizations were later riddled through bots and social networks.
In this context, Prosperi denounced the theft of the nation's assets held abroad.
I also want to denounce, as I have already done before, and I ratify it because of what has been happening with the resources of Venezuela, which were illegally retained abroad. I'm referring to the dividends of the Citgo company, the alleged humanitarian aid, and the bankruptcy of the Monomeros company. The so-called humanitarian aid that the government of the United States has given to these pseudo-leaders of the opposition has been derived for the benefit and enrichment of a small group.
In Venezuela, the National Bolivarian Armed Forces met with a United Nations delegation of international election experts currently in Venezuela to observe the process of next July 28th presidential elections. Here is a special envoy Yunus with the details.
The United Nations delegation invited to monitor the electoral process in Venezuela visited the country's Ministry of Defense today. The Minister of Defense received and explained to the experts the role of the armed forces to provide security to the electors, take care of the electoral material, and protect the electoral centers. This operation, called Republic Plan, is already underway.
This is an eminently civil act. It is a civic act. It is not a military one. I want to make that very clear at this table. We do not meddle in the internal processes of the National Electoral Council. We respect it a lot.
The UN Secretary General has sent the delegation upon invitation of the electoral authorities in Venezuela.
With a profound sentiment of responsibility, have the United Nations and the Secretary General decided to respond positively to the invitation of the National Electoral Council to deploy a group of experts, which is a mechanism of accompanying the elections technically.
The delegation has already met with Venezuela's foreign minister and authorities from the National Electoral Council. It will only provide a confidential report for the Secretary General at the end of the visit.
These days, we have begun the official meetings of coordination with all authorities, and we will continue with contacts with all political parties, all candidates, and all active forces in the country that take part in this process.
Once the election date was known, the National Electoral Council has started to provide invitations to international watchers and organizations with expertise in election matters so they could come to Venezuela. According to the Venezuelan Foreign Minister, 635 watchers have already confirmed their arrival in Venezuela to witness the elections.
There are organizations, foundations like the Carter Center, the Center of Latin American Experts for Elections, the African Union, more than 65 electoral organizations or election bodies of the world. Some of them at the level of director will come to Venezuela. Governments have been invited. Furthermore, the political parties have also invited attendants and watchers.
In the meantime, all over the country, the 10 candidates' campaign for the presidency and programmatic debate is continuing with different proposals and activities until July 25. Yunus Soner, Telesur, Caracas, Venezuela.
And the current candidate of the Venezuelan far right has blood on his hands, so say Salvadoran citizens who witnessed the dark role played by Edmundo Gonzalez when he served as the right-hand man of Leopoldo Castillo, who in the 1980s was the Venezuelan ambassador in San Salvador. Our correspondent Roberto Hugo Pres obtained testimonies from people who witnessed this questionable chapter of the now presidential candidate of the opposition. Let's see.
At the end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s, in the middle of the Civil War, Leopoldo Castillo was appointed ambassador of Venezuela, a person who, from the diplomatic headquarters, would have financed death squads that assassinated thousands of Salvadorans, among them priests and 4 nuns of the Marignol order. Former guerrilla commander Nidia Diaz recalls that the conspiracy plan to torture, capture, disappear, and kill opponents was planned from the Venezuelan embassy and directed by Leopoldo Castillo.
He was later named Priest Killer. That is how he is known, for being an agent of death and persecuting Christians in the country. I do not doubt that he may have known or be linked in some way to the murder of San Romero, because later we learned that he was also involved in the murder of the Marignol nuns that happened in November 1982, and they also murdered many priests.
Nidia Diaz recalls that while she was a prisoner of war, 2 people from the Venezuelan embassy came to interrogate her. One of them was Castillo, whose closest collaborator was the now candidate of the Venezuelan ultra-right, Edmundo Gonzalez. Veteran diplomat Ruben Zamora says that, at the time, the United States carried out interference operations in Latin American countries, and that the Venezuelans were accomplices in several crimes, which shows that Venezuela tolerated and sheltered self-confessed terrorists.
Just the fact that important people of the Venezuelan Christian democracy helped the armed forces of El Salvador, an armed force that was absolutely violating human rights, is already a crime.
Declassified CIA documents revealed that people from the Venezuelan embassy were mentioned as co-responsible for the intelligence services, authors of covert operations of the death squads, which carried out a series of massacres during Operation Centauro, financed by the United States. According to former congressional president Sigfrido Reyes, Edmundo Gonzalez, the candidate of the Venezuelan ultra-right, was a witness and accomplice to these brutal acts.
Edmundo González ostenta ese tenebroso pasado Edmundo Gonzalez has this dark past and is directly responsible and co-author of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed against innocent and defenseless people who had stood up against a despotic regime. Edmundo Gonzalez has blood on his hands, and in El Salvador he is remembered as a deadly man.
For this historian, the Venezuelan ultra-right wing was used by the United States for its political purposes, an interference that has been maintained for years.
The United States had its interests in preventing the advance of the revolutions in the Central American countries, and Carlos Andrés Pérez wanted international prestige. That is how hunger and need came together in the Salvadoran conflict, and that is how Venezuela entered. Since then, and even now in El Salvador, there is a group of Venezuelans working for the government of President Bukele, linked to the right wing against Chavism. So if you look at them, they are a kind of cabinet in El Salvador, people close to the Venezuelan right wing.
Despite the evidence and documents that have been declassified, both Castillo and González have denied such actions by an interfering government acting in complicity with U.S. destabilization plans.
Roberto Hugo Presa, Telesur, El Salvador.
Let's take a short break, but remember you can join us on TikTok at Telesur English, where you'll find news in different formats, news updates, and much more. We'll be right back, stay with us. Welcome back. In Chile, supermarket employees continue on strike to demand higher wages and better working conditions. The National Workers Federation called the strike. The union groups some 14,000 members and is the sector's largest. At least 80 supermarkets remain closed and 53 are partially open throughout the country. Workers demand a 20% increase in wages, which will lower cost of living adjustments, bonuses, better working conditions, restrooms in all stores, and more security. In Bolivia, President Luis Arce denounced that the right wing and fascism tried to cover up the attempted coup d'etat on June 26 with false speeches. The Bolivian president affirmed that only the right wing and fascism tried to cover up the attempted coup d'etat, calling it a self-coup and using disinformation and fake news in their favor. In this sense, President Arce affirmed that behind this attempted coup d'etat, there are economic interests that seek to take possession of the country's mineral resources, such as lithium. On the other hand, he thanked the support of the international community and affirmed that the people and the government will go out to defend the people's democracy whenever it is necessary. In Ecuador, 2 of the 5 people accused for the assassination of presidential candidate Fernando Villavicencio on August 9, 2023 have been delivered a 34-year and 8-month sentence. According to a press release issued by the Attorney General's office, following an 8-day trial, perpetrator Carlos Edwin and co-perpetrator Laura Dayanara have been sentenced to serve 34 years and 8 months in prison. The court also ruled on the case of 3 other accomplices, which were sentenced to 12 years in prison. Fernando Villavicencio was murdered by a group of 7 Colombian hitmen 11 days prior to the first round of the extraordinary general elections. The 7 hitmen are already dead. That's why only 5 people stood trial. In a related story, Fernando Villavicencio's sister Alexandra Villavicencio said that although justice has been served in the case of those 5 individuals, the people who masterminded the assassination of her brother and anyone involved in it should be prosecuted as well. Meanwhile, Fernando Villavicencio's daughters, Tamia and Amanda, said in a statement that the ruling in the case of those 5 defendants is the least Ecuadorian justice could do for a man like Fernando. In Puerto Rico, the Independence Party has filed an appeal before the Supreme Court, arguing the referendum called on by Governor Pedro Pierluisi is unconstitutional and fraudulent. Independence Party candidate Juan Dalmau said the proposed referendum is a desperate attempt by the leaders of the New Progressive Party. At a press conference, Independence Party leaders denounced that the referendum is a strategy of the New Progressive Party to mobilize voters in November, aimed at rebuilding voters' trust and encourage turnout. The Independence Party also warned that such a referendum would go against the separation of powers, freedom of speech, equal protection under the law, and the right to vote. In the United States, authorities of the Arizona State San Carlos Appalachian Indian Reservation have declared a state of emergency due to a raging fire. The fire, which started as a watch fire, has burned over a dozen houses, leaving 75 people homeless, and another 400 have been evacuated. The regional authorities presume the fire, which so far has burned through 5 square kilometers of land, was human-caused. Appalachian Reservation authorities have requested the assistance of the federal government for help in what they consider to be the largest disaster in the state for the past 30 years. Meanwhile, in Nepal on Saturday, rescue teams continue to search for at least 60 people missing after an avalanche caused by heavy rain swept 2 buses into a river. Dozens of police officers are involved in the rescue efforts for the second day in a row, using drones and underwater cameras. Only 3 passengers from the buses managed to escape the accident by jumping before the vehicles plunged into the river. The rest of passengers remain missing. The accident took place early Friday morning on a road southwest of Kathmandu, when a bus carrying 41 passengers and another carrying another 24 were swept by a large landslide into a river. Like this, we have come to the end of the short break. But before, we invite you to join our WhatsApp community for our English-speaking audience. You can scan the QR code on screen to join directly, share the link to reach more people. Constant news coverage of Latin America and the Caribbean as well as the rest of the world. Final short break. Don't go away.
From the south is part of the TTTL of
Welcome back. In Palestine, Israeli occupation troops committed a new massacre in Gaza, attacking a humanitarian area. Dozens of wounded were brought to Nasser Hospital after the regime launched an airstrike on Al-Mawasi humanitarian camp west of Han Yunis. The Palestinian Health Ministry reported that 71 people were killed and 289 wounded in the attack. According to journalists on the ground, Israeli warplanes fired 5 missiles that struck near tents and a water distillation plant in Al-Mawasi. The targeted site had been designated by Israeli forces as a safe humanitarian zone. Next Friday, July 19th, the International Court of Justice will rule on the Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. The ICJ will make public its advisory opinion on the legal consequences of Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem, following a 5-month investigation at the request of the United Nations General Assembly. Last February, 52 countries presented arguments to the tribunal to seek an end to the ongoing genocide in the Gaza Strip, while the ICJ waits issuing arrest warrants for senior Israeli officials. And Palestinian rescue teams recovered the bodies of at least 60 people killed by Israel in the Gaza neighborhood of Tal al-Hawa after the partial withdrawal of occupation army troops. Eyewitnesses report that Israeli soldiers executed civilians, including women, elderly children, and entire families, inside their homes in the said Gaza neighborhood. So far, 60 bodies have been recovered, but the work continues as there are dozens of bodies on the rubble. During their 2-week offensive, the Zionist troops also destroyed the patient-friendly hospital from where more bodies were recovered. Despite the partial withdrawal from the area, occupation forces are still stationed in nearby areas with snipers deployed in several surrounding buildings. "118 countries reaffirmed their support to the United Nations Agency for Palestine Refugees in the midst of a campaign of attacks and discrediting or taken by Israel." This was announced by the head of the agency, Felipe Lazzarini.
118 member states have signed off of this joint commitment, and among them we have all the members of the Security Council. And this, today, it's an important day for the agency because you know that we are also undergoing fierce attacks which are politically motivated, and hence the importance that member states restate their support and their trust to the agency to whom they are conferring such an important mandate.
On the other hand, Lazzarini referred to the dramatic situation of Gazan children in the midst of a genocide perpetrated by the State of Israel.
We have today in Gaza 1 in 2 persons under the age of 18. We have in Gaza more than 600,000 girls and boys living in the rubble, deeply traumatized, and for whom our joint commitment should be to bring them back as soon as possible in an education environment if we do not want to sacrifice an entire generation and sow the seeds for more violence in the future.
In other news, in Nigeria, 22 people are dead and another 132 have been injured following the collapse of a 2-story school in the Jos North district in Jos North City. Most of the victims were students who were taking exams. All survivors are getting medical attention at nearby clinics. 154 people were rescued from the scene. It's an academic school in Plateau State, but there are still desperate parents searching for their children amidst the rubble. Government has ordered all hospitals in the Jos North district to give priority to the collapse victims, regardless of documentation or means to pay.
Well, I've seen the story buildings collapsed, and I think for now there are low chances of us finding any more survivors. But we are here to see, and we're hoping for the best.
We have come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. So join us on social media, Facebook, X, Instagram, Telegram, and TikTok. For Telesur English, I'm Luis Alberto Matos. Thank you for watching.